Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Welcome back. We're wrapping up chapter 13 today, and given that it may be a week before we're together again, we may hold off on 14. So we're just probably a quick study today, maybe a little bit of reflection on where we are so far in this gospel. But let me jump in here. We're at verse 36, a follow-up conversation where Jesus has told the disciples that they have a new commandment and that he is about to be glorified and that they cannot go where he's going. And Peter, who in the disciples always has the role of kind of the one who asks questions, he follows up with Jesus, and which is what we read now. So Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus answered, "Where I'm going, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow afterward." Peter said to him, "Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." Jesus answered, Will you lay down your life for me? I tell you the truth, before the rooster crows, you will have denied me 3 times. A story that's in all of the Gospels, the idea that Jesus is not only betrayed, but he's denied, he's abandoned by the disciples, that ultimately when Jesus is on the cross, he is alone. He is forsaken. He is abandoned and left to his own. Here we have, I don't know, Michael, I feel like in many of those stories, Peter comes across as kind of overconfident. Here we have, I think this is a toned down version of it. He says, I will lay down my life for you. And in other words, I love you. I'm willing to die for you. And Jesus, then predicts this scene that we're well aware of in the Gospels, that before the morning, before the rooster, Peter will have denied Jesus. In John, this is a kind of a passing story. This story gets dug into more deeply in the other Gospels. But John is kind of checking the boxes as we move toward, and it's going to be a while now before we move toward the actual events that are going to facilitate that. But here again, I think John is preparing us for that moment where Jesus really is by himself. He is alone in the fulfilling of his mission here.
This is a interestingly connected text to both what comes before and after. In some ways, I think it is a transition text in the Gospel of John. It provides us with an opportunity to see what is the fallout that comes directly after Jesus's naming of his accuser. And what we had yesterday, of course, was this admission that really that there's a lack of understanding. We have this idea that well, and really that was not last study, it was the one before, where we were talking about how there's this question of, why is Judas leaving the room, right? And what does this whole thing mean about a person who's going to betray him? Then we have this teaching that we just went through yesterday of the new commandment. We're talking a little bit about this idea that the command, the call is to love one another. Now we skip forward to today, and I think what we see here is in some ways just a tough transition piece where Simon Peter says, "Where are you going?" Where we haven't up to this point have any reason to think that Jesus is going somewhere necessarily, but here we've got this transition which allows us then to see the question that there is a going happening. Jesus is preparing to do a thing, and then it provides opportunity for this teaching. You cannot follow, but you will follow after. And Peter, I think you're right to point out, Clint, in lots of times we see Peter portrayed with hubris or arrogance or at least a desire to reach. In this case, there's no reason to think that this is told in any way other than Peter is asking Jesus, "What do you mean? Why can't we follow you? I'm truly here to be connected to you." And ultimately, I think what we see is even in the face of the command, that great command to love one another, Jesus is making it clear at what could be a mountaintop revelation experience for all of those people gathered there, that what's going to be followed by this experience, Jesus already knows is going to be not just betrayal, but it's also going to be denial. Jesus is not just going to be turned in, but the people who have no part in turning him in are going to be the very people who fall back into the crowd and give Jesus up to the accusers. And I think, Clint, that's a very kind of sobering and yet also helpful way of framing the story, because John helps us see that in the midst of both the evil of the forthcoming betrayal, also the amazing mountaintop of Jesus revealing this commandment, right? How will you know one another? Well, by love. And then now as Peter follows this up, well, essentially between the lines, I love you so much, I will lay down my life for you. Jesus is making clear that no human love is going to be perfect. No human love will go to the end in the way that Jesus's love will do. There's some hope in that, I think, because Jesus is naming right off the bat, right off of the backside of this commandment, that Jesus knows that perfect following of that law is not going to happen, and he just brings that right out to the forefront.
I think in all the Gospels, there is a sense in which Jesus simply cannot be fully known before the cross. The revelation of who Jesus is and what he does is a revelation that is confirmed and informed by Easter. And so there's no reason to think that Peter doesn't have the best of intentions here, but it's simply not a thing that is his to claim at this point. He isn't able to understand. And again, you could read this last verse as criticism. I'll tell you the truth. Before the rooster crows, you deny me 3 times. Or there could be compassion in that. You would lay down your life for me. Before the morning, you're going to even say you don't know me. And so I think that idea of fear and loss and what it is going to do to the disciples before the experience of resurrection and what that is going to do with them. You can't follow me now, but you will follow afterwards. That's the afterwards there is a reference to the glorification of Christ. He just has used that language, being glorified. And until that happens, Peter's best intentions are well-intentioned, but empty and shallow and, short-sighted. And so I think I think there is a lot here for a short passage. I think maybe it's also a good time, Michael, to just, since we're going to have next week off, and then I think it makes some sense to keep chapter 14 together. I think maybe this is a good opportunity to just pause and say, as readers of this gospel, as we move to the end of the 13th chapter, which is also sort of a transition to dialogue. We now have a couple of chapters of dialogue and prayer. What have we learned? What has John told us about Jesus? And we start with the light has come into the darkness, and in the beginning was the Word. We have Word and light. Then we've seen that confirmed by John the Baptist. We've seen Jesus perform signs. We know at this point, we've said this, John is keeping no secrets. Jesus is the Messiah, is the Son of God, has now been betrayed, or at least the betrayer is off to do that. This is a poignant moment in the gospel, and I think John has equipped us, maybe more so than the other gospels. The way that John tells the story is to tip his hand. And we essentially, at this point in the story, now we're going to learn some things in the dialogue that follows, but at this point, we know essentially everything we need to know to be ready to hear the rest of what happens.
Well, even if we didn't have chapter 14 and everything that's going to follow it, even if this is where the story ended, I think you can see a kind of summation in the text that we have for today, because Jesus is making it clear that he's going to go to a place the disciples cannot go. And that's a really critical statement that maybe it seems obvious to us, but ultimately Jesus is making it abundantly clear that what he is going to accomplish is not something that other people with good intentions could accomplish by themselves. And the disciples have been the closest ones. They have been in Jesus's inner circle. They've seen the man who was blind be healed. They've seen the water turned into wine. They've seen the teaching of the Samaritans. That they've seen Jesus at work in these spectacular ways, right? And yet, these individuals, even the chief leading voice amongst them, who pledges his love and loyalty to Jesus, these will not be able to do the thing that Jesus has to do. And why? Well, because Jesus is the Son of God. And John, like you say, Clint, has not hidden that throughout any of this text. So therefore, what we see even now without the glorification to come, what we see is that Jesus is representing and incarnating, would be the theological word, God in the world in such a way that what he can do is substantially different than what his followers can do. Jesus has to go first. But don't miss the good news in that. If Jesus chooses to go first, as we know that he will, then that opens the door for everyone who follows him to go first. And don't miss the power of Peter's question here. Why can I not follow you now? And Clint, I submit to you, that's a little bit of every Christian's quandary, even to this day, right? Or why can't we come now? Well, Jesus, why can't this be resolved? Because we're waiting. Because we are not the ones to make the first move. That's Jesus and his prerogative. I think, though it's not the direct intention of the text, I think John here is trying to give us some narrative boundaries in which to understand Jesus's teaching. I think that the voice of Peter and the desire of Peter continues to live in the heart of Christians today, as we want to sincerely love others as Jesus calls us to. We sincerely want to follow Jesus where he calls us. And yet we know how often we find ourselves making the wrong choice or choosing the wrong path or failing in the moment when our faith gives out. And I just think that there's a beautiful kind of, once again, grace in a text like this, Clint.
I'm not sure that I would have noticed it, Michael. I don't think of, the idea of the 13th chapter versus the 14th chapter, the 12th versus the 13th, possibly. But it's interesting if you look at the flow of the story from here on out. Jesus' miracles are done. Jesus is not going to do another thing. He's not going to preach again. He's not going to argue with the Pharisees again. There is a sense where maybe the right line is the 13th chapter versus the 14th, but there is a sense in which at the point that Jesus says these things, his work kind of is done, with the exception of remaining faithful and facing the cross. But so many of the things that have been important in the first half of this gospel are really, they're now behind us. And
Right.
it changes now to dialogue and teaching and prayer, and then ultimately standing before the authorities and being sentenced to death. But this is an interesting transition in that way. The way that John tells the story, which has most of those things far earlier, allows him to kind of draw a line there and say, okay, now Jesus has done all that he's going to do in regard to preaching and miracles and fighting with Pharisees. Now what comes next? I think that's an interesting aspect of this gospel.
Well, and don't forget that where we are going to end here today is actually in some ways a bookmark to the end of this gospel, Clint. And we'll come back and we'll remember to mention this moment. But it is striking that Peter gets an opportunity to respond to this conversation about love that he has with Jesus on this night. Later in the gospel, in fact, the very end of the gospel, Peter is asked 3 questions by Jesus. And I think so here Jesus is predicting a betrayal, and there's going to come a time when Peter receives reconciliation for that betrayal, and this in some ways is the first word that sets off how the gospel's going to end. I do think there's a moment here where John is recognizing that Jesus's ministry in a public sense has concluded, all those things that you name. It now remains in the private sense. The disciples, the inner circle, will still be taught by Jesus and prayed for by Jesus. And then ultimately, when Jesus makes this very public self-giving, then following that, his ministry will broaden out that to not just the inner circle, not just to those people he's had conflict with and the individual healings and the teachings, but it's going to be the whole world. It'll be cosmic. And I do think that flow in the stories on purpose, and I actually think it helps us understand the extent to which Jesus Christ, as the incarnate Son of God, is doing the work of God in the world. This is cosmic level stuff, and yes, we see it told in these individual stories, but there's always more beneath the surface.
Yeah, I like the way that John does this. It gives it a sense of immediacy. I'm going somewhere and you can't follow. And then he almost puts that on pause for a moment as we get these coming up conversations about what it will mean to follow later and what it will look like to be faithful. This is a really interesting moment in the Gospel of John.
So as has been alluded to a couple times here, grateful for all of you who join us regularly for these studies. We're just going to be off on break next week. We'll be gone for just Monday through Thursday next week and then back the week following. So hope that you all do well. If you've missed some other episodes, next week will be a great time to get caught up on it. Like this video if it's been helpful. Subscribe so you don't miss the next episode in approximately 10 days. And we look forward to seeing you all then.
Thanks, everybody.